Good day and shalom, and welcome to session 2 in this journey that we're on. And today I'm going to concentrate on the concept of rakia. So without further ado, let us jump straight into the Torah, chapter 1 of Bereshit, Genesis. I'm going to skip a couple of verses from where we stopped last time and leap straight to verse 6. And this is what it says. It says, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Rakia, B'toch hamayim vihi mavdil ben mayim lamayim. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate between water and water. So the word rakia there is translated in this version I have as firmament, which I think is fine. It comes from the verb raka, which means to create and expand. So I think probably an expanse is a better translation. And later in about verse 9, it says something rather strange. It didn't say God called the firmament heaven, but it said God spoke to the firmament heaven. And I think to call it heaven, which I've seen it translated as, is a little bit misleading. So let's have another look at it. Rakia is described as the second level of heaven. And the first level is rather lovely. It's called vilon, which is described as a curtain or a veil which is drawn across the skies at night so the sun doesn't keep us awake, which is very thoughtful. And obviously we hope drawn back again in the morning so that we can enjoy some lovely sunshine. Now, obviously, that really isn't what happens because no matter how much we want to look for a curtain, as much as we want to find one across the sky, there isn't one. And so it needs some translation and thought at another level of consciousness. And heaven is much the same. Shemayim, sky waters, obviously relating to this separation of the waters from above, from the waters below, the two waters. And Shemayim being plural, but relates specifically to a pair. It does relate to those two waters. But I don't know how far we'd have to look before we find water way up in the stratosphere. There may be some there, but it's going to be a long time before we have the resources to find some. And so like Vilon, Rakia, the space that's created between the waters needs to be looked at a level of consciousness. And if we look at the water that's on the earth, it's physical water, called in the Hebrew Chaim Mayim, living water, because without it there is no life. And this water above, these waters above that the Rakia separates, really is a spiritual water. And it's interesting that we have this connection, rather an intimate connection between what is real and what we can see on earth, and also a counterpart in the heavens. And it does take a little stretch of the imagination to try and get our heads around these things. But I always remember reading a little while ago now what the Baal Shem Tov said, which would have been around the middle to, from the beginning maybe to the middle of the 18th century. And the translation into English is described as rather archaic, but I think it does the job. And he said that it is our goal, that's something that we should be aiming for, to inhabit a higher consciousness. And to do that, we must retreat from the sensory experience of this world, transcending its allure and arresting demand for our attention. Now, if we decipher all that lot into sort of modern day language, I think we'd find that is as relevant then as it is today, and perhaps even more relevant today, because if we think how we are captivated by the world, social media, or the advertising gurus that are trying to get us to buy things that we don't really need, and they say, well, what, you deserve this, or you must have this. And the best is saying that we need to retreat from that and not be taken in by it and held captive by it. And I think at this time when we're celebrating Pesach and reminiscing and remembering what our ancestors went through and this release from slavery in Egypt into freedom and eventually into the land of Israel, the promised land, that's a good time to think about being held captive to the wiles of the advertising media and everything else that goes on, internet and TikTok and all these things, most of which I don't understand, but I know, particularly from my grandkids, that they are held captive by it. They can't escape. Take away iPhone for a day, they suffer withdrawal symptoms. So it's worth thinking about this escaping. And part of that escape is to look at the Torah and some of the concepts there and see if we can move to a higher level of consciousness. And Rakia, I think, has caused some problems in the past through literalism and being trapped and captivated by literalism. And if you look at it and you think, well, there's just water above and water below, something must be holding it up and keeping it all from falling down here again. And so it was translated as, and people thought of it as a sort of upturned copper bowl. The planets and the stars were embedded in the outer casing of this copper bowl, and God himself, the creator, was somewhere outside that. And that's sort of the philosophy of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, where you have these external gods that are external to us. They seem to be always angry. And we keep having to appease them, particularly in fertility rites and to make sure that we have crops. But it does speak then and gives us this sort of idea of a rather remote God who was and is usually angry, just gives us a slap every time we get something wrong, but doesn't really care too much about creation. And quite honestly, that sort of theme is a little bit depressing and not how we should maybe or how we could look at it. And that Greek philosophical thought has even sneaked its way into some forms of Christianity. And I say this from experience when I studied in another life, and many, many years ago now, at the University of Cape Town, that our systematic theology professor, one of the first things he tried to instill upon us was that God was outside of the universe. He came up with the term other than the universe, which is that Greek philosophical thought which has sneaked its way in and proved rather popular. And so we become rather needy, that we rely on God, or the Greek gods in their case, to give us everything we have, that we have no control. They're external, they don't really care too much about us. And feeling that neediness is also not good for our self-esteem and our mental health. Much better to be needed, and we can get onto that in another time. And I think we can show that we are actually needed, which is a tremendous help in these days when people suffer so much mental anguish and low self-esteem. And so, if we look at the Rakia as the second level of heaven, we've got Shechachanu, which is the clouds, which is the third level, and goes on and on and on, and there's 7 of them altogether, which means that the heavens as an encompassing term for the whole thing must be much greater than Rakia, and in fact it encompasses everything. And so we have this idea that we are part of creation, that Hashem himself, in creating the universe and us, created space within himself, as we mentioned last time, and we are an intimate part of him, blended in him. And so he cares deeply for his creation, including us. And we're needed, we're not needy. He's not external to us. He can communicate with us. And everything that we see is a part of him. And just on a practical level, I was reminded of this yesterday. And just a side story, that my doctor, I fell out of a bus and got my shin caught on the tail lift ramp that we put wheelchairs on with, and it didn't heal so well. And I got talked into going to see the doctor, which was against my will, because I know these things, you know that it's not going to end well. And they took blood tests and found that I was overweight, as always. Blood sugar levels, not great, but I'd sort of had a whole chocolate cake before I went, so not surprising. And they put me on one of these NDPP, I think they call it, awareness courses run by the NHS. Very good. Which is like a glorified Weight Watchers on the NHS, and they keep asking me, how much do you weigh now, and how many steps did you do today? And last time, I must admit, I got a bit fed up with this, so they said, how many steps did you do today? I said 4, which was not really true. I'd done probably 5 or 6, but I hadn't done a lot that day, I must admit. So I didn't go down that well, because I'm supposed to do something like 5,000. How I'm supposed to count them, I'm not sure. I'd lose the will to live after about 20 steps down the road. But anyway, it's a long story, but it has a relevance. And so yesterday I decided that I had a bowl of porridge, so I need to walk this off according to them. I'm not going to do 5,000 steps, but I can do some. So I went for a walk with my wife and granddaughter, and we walked where we live in southern England. Excuse me, and Rakia, Villon, that the curtain was drawn well back. It was a lovely sunny day, and we walked down somewhere called Monk's Brook. And it's just a little walkway with some grass and the brook that runs through it. And because I'm a sucker for punishment, I went again today. I did another 100 steps. I don't know what, but it's better than nothing. But on my trip, I looked, and I've been there before, but it's a lovely day. And you know what? There were daffodils growing, white ones, lovely, and the normal yellow ones. There were some ducks, and of course lots of birds who were all fluttering around and looking at building nests. And so I was thinking about what I was going to put into this video about us being part of the Creator himself, blended intimately in with him, that he cares for us. I remember what we touched on briefly last time when we talked about the divine light and of creative energy coming to us through many diminishments. And we spoke very briefly a little bit in the Mishnah and in the morning Shabbat Siddur passage, where we said that he sends down his divine energy and recreates creation daily, continuously. Now, I can look at these things now in a different light, bearing that in mind. So when I look at a daffodil growing on the sides of the brook there in the sunshine, it looks fantastic. But when I look at it with that slightly raised level of consciousness that the Baal Tem Shov says is our goal, I can imagine and I can see and I can meditate upon the fact that that is receiving a divine energy, the same as they, obviously on a different level. Life-giving energy for a plant is much different from a stone, is much different from us, of course, but it's still God's life energy, the sparks that come down in creation, which are being renewed and upgraded daily, continuously. And so there I'm looking at a simple daffodil. I'm watching a duck swimming up and down the brook. I can see and hear some of the birds in their business of making nests. And I am looking at and being part of creation. I'm seeing a little spark of my Creator in that. Now, I've found that a very uplifting thought. And it takes me into a slightly different realm, as the best suggested we do, an upper level of consciousness. And it's interesting to meditate on that. Try it. It might not work for you, but it works for me. But it raised my hope. It raised all those things that we've been through, particularly in lockdown. And, I had a feeling life is fine. I hope it's fine for you. And next time we'll move on with the story and have another look at one of life's lessons in the Torah. Shalom.